my life depended on understanding two things about international affairs today: the power of the individual and our global interconnectedness. And on the first, what I'm talking about is essentially the new tools that have been given to individuals. There's been just dramatic changes in technology, especially related to communication and travel. And so we've seen 9/11 done by a group of individuals. We've seen now the events in the Middle East of political protests are spreading, and it's largely driven by activists who are able to organize internally through the internet or spread tactics from one group of activists to another group of activists in another country. Or they can instantly share pictures of what their government is doing, and it then sparks even more participation. And so ultimately, I could talk about a lot of different examples of this. There's WikiLeaks out there, and there's a whole host of tools and platforms available to individuals. But the bottom line is that individual actions are changing government policies. Now, on the second, our interconnectedness often manifests itself through transnational problems and cross-border problems. And so, staying in the Middle East, there's a fair amount of militant activity that crosses borders with ease these days. And that's another thing I've been focusing on lately. And yet, you can also think of disease, and it's just how disease obviously knows no boundaries. Or let's see, what's it? Anyway, that's the point. That interconnectedness is. Oh yes, I was going to talk about financial contagion, which essentially is we had the Great Recession here in 2008 that spread throughout the world, and then suddenly the Greek bond crisis, which threatened to spread even further. And so I think all of us didn't grow up thinking about the Greek workers or the fiscal decisions of folks in Athens, but it does matter, and how workers are treated abroad does matter right here. And not only just how the economic side of it, but also their choices about health, their choices about the environment and security. And so here comes one of the big points of the night that starts, three words that more or less summarizes one of my points. And that is that citizens everywhere matter. And so governments can no longer work towards providing services to the folks in their territories without being centrally concerned about the citizens and events outside their borders as well. Now compare that with the activities of governments today, and you have a growing disconnect between what I just described and then the system of states that was created in the 17th century. And so governments still represent their citizens internationally, but they're not the only representatives, and they're not the only ones acting outside their borders. And so as a result, what I increasingly see is that when it comes to diplomacy, we're often focused as a country on the wrong players. And when it comes to development and economics, we're focused on the wrong approach. And when it comes to defense, we're focused on the wrong threat. So essentially, when I start to talk about how to address these global problems that I started off with, I think we need to change the conversation. It's no longer it's not exclusively worth talking about what states need to do with other states. Now we need to change the subject and talk about what states need to do with other citizens. And essentially, I think what you'll find is that it becomes a citizen-based foreign policy. So what does that look like? Let's stay with Egypt in the Arab Spring, because I think that was one of the best examples of on the one hand, the old foreign policy clashing with the power of groups of individuals in society. And so the US showed up, and they weren't alone. They showed up essentially to the Arab Spring, on the one hand, wanting to support individuals pursuing their freedoms, but also stuck with how to maintain other national interests, like maintaining peace agreements signed between states. And so it essentially was the case where we showed up to the game with the wrong equipment, and it showed. And so, and there's a reason for that. And my sense is that when it comes to diplomacy today, your influence is no longer dictated by how big your population is, by how strong your army is, by how big your economy is. It's what you consistently stand for. And so one of the things that I've experienced now through the years is that there are a set of common interests shared by citizens everywhere. And so whether I was working with tribal leaders in Iraq along the Syrian border, or beekeepers in northern India, just like people here, the main interest is often, how do I make sure tomorrow is just a little bit better than today? And so whether that means education for their kids or they're getting a better job or making sure they have a job or basic health. Essentially, today, in an interconnected world, the best diplomatic tools are going to be those that are in making sure that you're relevant for those issues that matter to citizens. So in development, we also have a tendency to be pretty protectionist when times are bad, or even when they're not sometimes. But ultimately, with the big part of the US economy being driven by exports, trade matters. The economy in other parts of the world matters. We need a vibrant Indonesia. We need a vibrant Brazil. And ultimately, the inability of workers in other places to get jobs impacts us right here through our companies or other things. And so in an interconnected world, it matters that we fight for workers and economic opportunity everywhere. So finally, on defense, again, we're often stubbornly stuck in this 20th century approach to war and between state armies. And yet the biggest attack on the United States this century has been 9/11 by a group of individuals, not a country. And I've interacted with a fair amount of military officers and in Iraq, and they're often telling me, look, we weren't prepared for what followed after that, which is essentially increasingly spending time on addressing the causes of instability in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. And it's because it often revolved around things like development and democracy. And so instead of basically throwing these 20th century militarization at international affairs today, what matters is the world's democracies engaging politically and economically with the poorest and most insecure parts of the world. Now, I had an experience firsthand with the power of the individual and with the limitations and how military superiority alone does not make us safe. And it was 2006. And I was in Iraq with the UN. It was the height of the Civil War. And we decided that we would try a civil society, citizens-based peace initiative. And so we were at the center of this effort was the people who had had enough with the violence. It was the teachers, it was the doctors, bakers, mothers, grandparents. And so we essentially thought that, if house by house, if mothers said, you know what, you're not going to bring your friend home because he's involved in some of the violence, and street by street, neighborhood by neighborhood, you start to lock out militant actors. And so we started moving, and we finally got an opportunity with a big militant guy who controlled a fair amount of area. And it was up in northwest Baghdad. And so we hop on, we go on up, and I'll never forget the office that was outside the mosque. It had cracked walls, it had calendars dated well before the conflict started, it had flickering fluorescent lights. And we scared the heck out of this young kid who was sitting behind an empty desk. It was probably the 4 or 5 security guards with shotguns and security guns with us, and machine guns with us. But he ushered us into the office where we're going to have our meeting, and puts us on oversized couches, plops down a camera right in front of us, and it had this eerie reminder of or similarity to some of the videos you see online after somebody's murdered by extremists. And so we kind of cough politely and look around the tripod and tell them to get rid of the thing. And the meeting goes on. Not long after, the windows shake, and our security guards are now getting a little upset, a little concerned. And so they usher us out of the room, and later they tell us that a kid, not 13 or 14 years old, threw a grenade into the compound and from a nearby alley. And so we get back in the cars, and the US was guarding us at the time, so it was 2 Humvees, 3 UN armored SUVs, and two more Humvees. And then we kind of get in the line to go through some Jersey barriers when poof, everything went black. And we were hit by a roadside bomb. And so I picked myself up off the floor of the car and fixed my helmet and flak jacket, and remarkably the driver is still is smiling. he did what he was supposed to do. He hit the gas pedal, which is remarkable to me still to this day. But anyway, we got through. And one Humvee was pulled over with a little bit of difficulties, but ultimately everyone was fine. I assume you don't need a lesson or a message to hit you over the head the way it did me, literally in this case. But I took a pretty strong message from that. And largely it was that, look, in the Cold War, the rationale was, I'm going to build the biggest army I can, because then if you attack me, I'm going to wipe you off the map. And so mutually assured destruction deterred attacks. But that doesn't work against the guy setting the roadside bomb. And so in an interconnected world, it's much more relevant to ensure that vulnerable populations, like the kid who threw the grenade, like the guy who set the bomb, are not vulnerable to the extremists. And so my sense is that it's more and more mutual empowerment of each other's citizens, not mutual deterrence. So look, technology is going to continue to develop, and I'm sure that there's a lot of talks to be done about how that means interconnectedness and how we can kind of close some of the gaps globally, but that's clearly a different talk. In the meantime, technology is going to continue to expose the actions of governments, and government influence around the world is going to be dictated by the value of those actions. So my sense is it's time to prioritize fighting for the rights of others wherever they're violated, for making sure their basic needs are met, and for ensuring that the security of individuals and the communities they live in are taken care of, and not just the security of governments. Thanks.